There is a comic out there that doesn't just push the boundaries of what's acceptable in storytelling. It burns those boundaries to the ground and keeps going. And today we're diving into one of the most psychologically disturbing stories ever put to paper. This is Crossed, and more specifically, it's the story of a character so deeply unsettling that by the end, you won't know whether to feel disgusted, sorry for him, or genuinely disturbed that part of his logic makes a twisted kind of sense. Hi, I am GrimLore, and this is Crossed Badlands, Yellow Belly. So here's what this video is actually about. We're going through the full story of Edmund Wickentorp, a teenager nicknamed Yellow Belly, set against the backdrop of one of the most brutal apocalypse scenarios in comic book history. Most people who talk about Crossed focus on the infected themselves, the violence, the shock value. But what makes this particular story so hard to shake is that the most disturbing character in it isn't a monster with a cross-shaped scar on his face. It's a scared, selfish, deeply flawed human being who keeps choosing himself over everyone around him every single time. We're going to go through his full arc, talk about what Harold Laurie's surprise appearance actually means for the story, and at the end, I want to share why I think Edmund might be one of the most honest and uncomfortable characters this series has ever produced. Let's get into it. Edmund Wickentorp was, by everyone's account at his school, a coward. Not just a little nervous or shy, genuinely, legendarily afraid of almost everything. The nickname Yellow Belly came from a real incident where he urinated on himself out of fear, and the thing is, Edmund didn't even argue with it. He knew it was true. He had spent 18 years watching other people seem comfortable in their own skin, watching them laugh at things that made him freeze. And he had quietly accepted that he was just built differently. And one of the people he watched most closely was a girl named Barry Ford. She was everything he wasn't in terms of social standing. And when she accidentally bumped into him one day at his locker, scattering books everywhere, he knew she hadn't meant to talk to him. She walked away and told her friends she needed to wash her arms because he had touched her. But Edmund, instead of feeling crushed by that, latched onto a single physical detail from that interaction and turned it into something he replayed in his head. That tells you almost everything you need to know about where his mind lives. His home life was quiet and unremarkable. While his classmates were out celebrating graduation at parties, Edmund was at a restaurant with his parents and his younger brother. He had just earned the right to use the family car, which sounds like a win until you find out the condition was that he could only drive it with his parents present. So his big new freedom was essentially being a bored chauffeur. And to shake things up, his father decided to take the family to a circus that had arrived in a nearby town. Edmund was not thrilled. The whole thing was an assault on his nerves. The noise, the crowd, the performers, doing things that made his stomach drop. But when his father called him Yellow Belly, something in him clicked, and he pushed himself inside to watch the main attraction. What they showed the audience was a caged man, presented as a wild human discovered in the mountains, feral and dangerous. They put a live diamondback rattlesnake in with him, and he bit into it and drank its blood while the crowd laughed and cheered. Edmund was barely holding it together, but his father told him it was all staged, all fake, just showmanship. And Edmund believed that, and he managed to get through the rest of the show by focusing on the trapeze performers, which brought its own kind of uncomfortable self-awareness because he caught himself thinking things he didn't want to admit. But for the first time in his life, he walked out of something scary and felt, just briefly, like he had done something, like he was almost normal. Backstage, though, his father's reassurance turned out to be dead wrong. The performer playing the wild man was an actor named Henry who was exhausted and genuinely frightened by how far his bosses were pushing the act. The rattlesnake wasn't supposed to be real. He was in the middle of complaining about it when the door opened and a man walked in with the same wild look, the same feral energy, except this one wasn't acting. This was a Crossed. And that was the beginning of everything falling apart. The infected swarmed the circus without warning. The Crossed, for anyone who needs a quick refresher, are people infected by a pathogen that removes every social inhibition and moral boundary a person has, leaving behind something that looks human but operates entirely on violence and depravity. And once someone is attacked and survives, they become one too. So what started as a family outing became a massacre in minutes. Edmund and his father ran with the crowd, trying to find somewhere to hide. His father found a cluster of barrels backstage and told his sons to get inside and stay quiet. He said goodbye to them. He told them he loved them. And then Edmund watched through the gaps as the cross got to his father and did things that no child should ever see done to a parent. And when it was over, his father stood back up. But it wasn't his father anymore. The thing wearing his father's face walked toward the barrel where his brother was hiding. And Edmund heard his brother screaming, begging. And Edmund did nothing. He shut down completely. And when he came back to himself, the circus was silent and empty except for the dead. He ran to the parking lot, found the car, and drove home. Not to warn anyone, not to call for help immediately. He drove home and climbed into his wardrobe and went to sleep, because that was the only place his brain knew how to go when the world became too much. His mother Joan eventually pulled him out of it and got him talking, and she called a neighbor who happened to be a police officer to hear the story. The officer listened, decided Edmund was either lying or having some kind of breakdown, and left. Joan told Edmund to stop telling stories, and Edmund, sitting there knowing exactly what he had seen, just absorbed that too. By morning, the story had already spread around school because the officer had told his son Bobby, who told everyone else, and now the whole town was laughing at Yellow Belly's killer clown delusion. But the cross were already there. They hit a house not far away, and a kid named Swinney barely made it out with a shotgun and his life. At Edmund's house, the infected arrived while Joan was still in the middle of screaming at Edmund about his father and brother not coming home. His father had told him to hide, so he ran to the wardrobe again and sat in the dark while his mother suffered at the hands of the crossed just on the other side of the door. And then he fell asleep again, because that's what his mind does. He woke up to a group of his classmates standing over him. Hank, Jim, Bobby, and Joe had come looking for him because he was the only person in town who had actually seen the crossed up close before they arrived. Edmund's first instinct was to run, and Hank, whose own mother had just been killed, told him point blank that this was the moment he needed to stop being who he was. And something about that landed. They moved through the town together, shooting Crossed in the head, which Edmund had figured out was the only reliable way to stop them. And when they reached a gun shop and gathered with other survivors, something genuinely unexpected happened. Edmund was praised. Hank apologized to him in front of everyone for years of bullying. Barry Ford, the girl who had once said she needed to wash her arms after touching him, came over and spoke to him like he was a person. Edmund felt, for maybe the first time ever, like he belonged somewhere. But that feeling had about 10 minutes left in it. A truck loaded with Crossed slammed into the building and the whole thing turned into chaos. Barry grabbed Edmund's arm and told him she was scared. She was looking to him for the courage he had just been showing everyone. And Edmund looked back at her, processed the situation, and ran. He left her there. He left all of them there. He watched from a distance as his classmates, the same people who had tormented him for years, fought and died trying to hold the line. And Swinney, who was still alive at that point, caught Edmund at the back exit and tried to stop him from leaving. Edmund shot him at point-blank range and kept moving. He hid in the forest. He slept. He dreamed about things completely unrelated to what had just happened. And when he woke up and went back to survey the damage, he found bodies he recognized. Hank, who had just given him the first real apology of his life. Swinney, who Edmund told himself would have died anyway, so really he had just moved up the timeline. He found enough justification to keep walking, and he walked to the neighboring town of Lakeside to warn them about what was coming. Nobody believed him. He tried everyone he could find, and then he spotted a motorcycle gang and made himself walk over and talk to their leader, a man named Rick. Rick looked at Edmund, decided he had nothing to lose by taking the warning seriously, and rallied his entire gang along with other groups in the area to arm up and prepare. Edmund had done something genuinely useful, and to celebrate, the gang brought him in, and it was in that night that he lost his virginity to a woman named Nicole and got a tattoo marking him as one of them. The battle happened. Rick's plan was solid and the gang was massive, and Edmund found himself standing at the edge of the forest again, doing the math on how many human shields were between him and the crossed. But then he saw Nicole running, chased by one of the infected. He fought with himself. He thought about what kind of person he was. And then he ran toward the crossed and shot it almost on reflex, which surprised even him. He rushed to Nicole, desperate for her to be okay. And when she turned around screaming with blood on her face, he fired again before his brain caught up with his hands. She hadn't been infected. It was just blood from the fight. Edmund had killed her by accident, and now he was standing there with a body and no story that would keep him alive when the gang came back. That's when Harold Laurie walked out of the trees. Harold is the protagonist of his own miniseries in this universe, and the Cross comics do this occasionally, where characters from different stories cross paths, and it works really well because it fills in gaps you didn't even know you had. Seeing Harold before the events of his main story is genuinely fascinating, even if what he does here is awful. Harold talked Edmund down from the edge, told him not to pull the trigger, and laid out a philosophy that was simple and cold. The world was ending. The old rules were gone. The people who would survive and eventually inherit what was left were people like them, people who understood that. But then Harold said something that crossed the line even by the standards of everything that had already happened. And together they did something to Nicole's body that I'm not going to describe in detail, but that made Edmund vomit when it was over. And when Edmund asked why they had done it, Harold told him they hadn't needed to. He said it almost cheerfully. Harold's whole point wasn't to corrupt Edmund. His point was to show Edmund that the corruption was already there, that Harold had just given it permission to exist out loud. Edmund destroyed what was left of Nicole's face so no one could see she didn't have the cross scar, staged the scene with another body, and walked back into the group as a hero. Rick's girlfriend, Donna, later pulled him aside, and in what Edmund clearly experienced as a moment of emotional release, he told her everything. The nickname, the fear, Nicole, Harold, all of it. Donna's face went white. She tried to leave and tell the others, and Edmund tied her up, not to hurt her, but because he wanted to be the one to confess. He wanted the credit for his own honesty, which, when you think about it, is still about him. He never got the chance because the cross attacked again and broke everything apart. Edmund freed himself, went back for Donna, and genuinely fought his way through the infected to get her out safely. Donna, standing in the forest with him afterward, looked at what he had just done and told him he was a hero, that he had become someone new that day. Edmund believed her completely. He closed his eyes, feeling something he had never felt before, like the fear was finally gone, like he had won. Donna picked up a rock and smashed his face with it, over and over. And the last thing Edmund heard, the very last words that reached him, were the ones his ears had been trained on his whole life, that he was a miserable coward, Yellow Belly. So here's what I keep thinking about with Edmund. He is one of the most genuinely uncomfortable characters in this entire series. And not because of the violence or the obvious horrible things he does. It's because his cowardice isn't a quirk or a character flaw that he eventually overcomes. It's the engine of every single decision he makes. Every time a choice appeared in front of him, a real one, stay or run, help or hide, tell the truth or cover it up, he chose himself. Every time. And the moments where he almost didn't, like running toward the cross to save Nicole, still ended in disaster because he acted before he was ready and then needed someone else to fix the consequences. Harold's role in the story is really interesting for this reason. A lot of people read that section and think Harold is the one who turned Edmund into something worse. But Harold didn't put anything into Edmund that wasn't already there. He just looked at Edmund and said out loud what Edmund had been quietly doing his whole life, which is making choices based entirely on what he wanted and then finding reasons afterward to feel okay about it. Harold gave him a framework for that. He told Edmund that the old world's rules no longer applied, and Edmund took that and ran with it in the worst possible direction, deciding it meant he had permission to feel nothing. And then there's this other layer to Edmund that I think is worth sitting with. The comic uses him to poke at a fantasy a lot of people have, this idea that in a crisis, in a real apocalypse, you would rise to the occasion. You would become the leader, the protector, the person everyone looks to. Edmund thinks that about himself too. He spends the whole story chasing that version of himself. And the comic is pretty ruthless in its answer, which is that some people, when the pressure comes, don't become better. They just become more of what they already were. Edmund under pressure was Edmund with the volume turned all the way up. His death is almost poetic in how fitting it is. He dies thinking he finally made it. He dies believing Donna's words. And then he gets killed in exactly the way he always feared, quietly, from behind, by someone he trusted while he had his eyes closed. He never saw it coming because he had stopped paying attention to anything outside of how he felt in that moment. He died being Yellow Belly, and he didn't even know it. If you want to see more of this universe, we have a full video on Harold Laurie's story in Cross Psychopath, which honestly hits different after seeing him here. Drop a comment below telling me what you thought of Edmund, whether you think he deserved his ending or whether there was a version of him that could have gone differently, because I genuinely go back and forth on that. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we go deep on stories like this regularly. And if you know someone who would appreciate this kind of breakdown, send it to them. Anyway, that's everything on Edmund Wickentorp, one of the most disturbing and, honestly, one of the most human characters Crossed ever produced. See you in the next one.